Elijah the Tishbite isn't just a name in the Bible. He's a powerful presence that transcends generations and contexts. Picture someone who seemingly comes out of nowhere, no grand introductions, and immediately starts shaping the destiny of a nation. That was Elijah. He appeared like a beacon of light during a time of spiritual darkness, a living reminder that God never abandons his people, even in the toughest moments. Elijah wasn't the kind of person who asked for permission to be bold. He just was. Why? Because his entire life was aligned with the mission God entrusted to him. It's like his soul was crafted for a higher purpose, one that only someone with his level of courage and faith could fulfill. If you think about it, Elijah teaches us something crucial: the importance of listening to God and following his guidance, even when it doesn't make sense at first. He lived in a time when the people of Israel were divided, spiritually lost, and their leaders were neck-deep in idolatry. But Elijah wasn't intimidated. He understood that obedience to God, even in the hardest moments, leads to results far beyond what our eyes can see. And isn't that true for us too? How many times do we hesitate to make decisions because we're afraid of the unknown? Elijah challenges us to take that step of faith. His story begins in such a unique way that it's hard not to be amazed. Elijah simply shows up, faces King Ahab, and declares a drought over the land. Just think about that for a second. An ordinary man with no royal title confronts the most powerful king of the time and announces something that would change everyone's fate. And what's more, he does it with the confidence of someone who knows God is in control. It's like Elijah is saying, it doesn't matter how big the challenge in front of you is. What matters is who's with you. Makes you stop and think, doesn't it? How often do we let fear hold us back when all we need to do is trust God and act? But Elijah's story isn't just about confronting kings or making prophecies. It's about walking with God, a journey that requires total commitment. He wasn't a superhero, he was human, just like you and me. He had moments of doubt, exhaustion, and fear. Yet he shows us that strength comes from God, not from our abilities. Elijah didn't rely on himself, he relied on God. And maybe that's one of the most valuable lessons we can learn from him. After all, how many times do we put more faith in our own skills than in God's direction? One fascinating detail about Elijah is how God provided for him in times of extreme need. Right after announcing the drought, God sent him to a place called Chariot, where he was fed by ravens. Yes, ravens. Animals that by human logic would be the last to bring food to anyone. It's a powerful reminder that God works in unexpected ways, and when you least expect it, he uses the most unlikely resources to provide what you need. Can you imagine what this means for our lives? God is the same today as he was in Elijah's time. So maybe you just need to stop looking at the obvious and start noticing the ravens God has already sent to help you. Another fascinating aspect is how Elijah dealt with rejection and opposition. Let's be real, it's not easy to stay faithful when everything around you is screaming at you to give up. But Elijah wasn't the type to follow the crowd. He teaches us that loyalty to God matters more than seeking approval from others. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between pleasing God and pleasing people? If so, you know how challenging that can be. Elijah reminds us that choosing God is always worth it, even when it feels like we're standing alone. On top of that, Elijah's life is proof that miracles happen when we put God first. Think about the widow in Zarephath. Elijah asked her to make him a small loaf of bread with the last bit of flour and oil she had. It sounds crazy to ask that of a woman who was on the brink of starvation. But what happened? God multiplied her resources in a supernatural way. That miracle didn't just sustain Elijah, it saved her and her son's lives too. It shows us that when we put God above our immediate needs, he takes care of all of them. Elijah was also a man who knew when it was time to withdraw and listen to God. After a major confrontation or victory, he often stepped back to spend time alone with the Lord. This highlights the importance of rest and communion with God. After all, how can we continue on our spiritual journey if we don't replenish our strength? It's like trying to drive a car on an empty tank. Elijah sets an example that, even in the chaos of life, we need to find time to seek God. And lastly, Elijah teaches us the importance of preparing the next generation. He knew his mission was bigger than himself. That's why he invested time in training Elisha, his successor. It makes you think, what are we doing to impact those who come after us? Are we passing on values, faith, and teachings that can transform lives? Elijah shows us that a life dedicated to God doesn't end with us. It continues through others. And so, Elijah's story leaves us on the edge of our seats, naturally transitioning to the next big events in his life. After such a grand introduction, what comes next? Well, it leads us to an unforgettable moment of confrontation, where God once again displays his extraordinary power. Mount Carmel was the stage for one of the most epic and challenging moments in the Bible. Picture the scene. On one side, Elijah, standing alone but confident in God. On the other, hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah, backed by a corrupt king and a divided people. This wasn't a battle fought with swords. It was a showdown of faith, a clash demonstrating the power of the living God. Elijah understood that this moment wasn't about him. It was about God's sovereignty. And that's exactly where the impact of this story lies, Elijah's unwavering confidence in the Lord. At that time, the people of Israel were spiritually lost. They'd wandered away, worshiping Baal and ignoring God's commandments. So Elijah proposed a challenge that would change everything. Each side would prepare an altar, lay wood and a sacrifice on it, but not light the fire. The real God would be the one who answered with fire from heaven. Elijah teaches us that sometimes we need to confront what's wrong head-on, without fear of upsetting others or being outnumbered. It makes you think, in what areas of our lives do we need to take a firm stand? The prophets of Baal went first. They danced, shouted, and even cut themselves, desperately trying to get the attention of a God that didn't exist. And Elijah, with boldness and a touch of sarcasm, mocked them. Shout louder, maybe he's sleeping. His sarcastic humor reveals something profound. When we trust God, we don't need to panic. He always acts at the right time. It's a practical lesson for modern life, where we often feel pressured to act impulsively or out of desperation. Elijah reminds us that trusting God brings peace, even in high-pressure situations. When it was Elijah's turn, he did something curious. Before praying, he asked them to drench the altar with water, something that seemed completely counterintuitive for someone expecting fire from heaven. But this wasn't overkill. It was a demonstration that God operates beyond human logic. Sometimes in our own lives, it feels like the circumstances are soaked with difficulties, making any progress seem impossible. Elijah encourages us to trust God even when everything looks hopeless. Then Elijah prayed. It wasn't a long, elaborate speech, just a simple, direct prayer. He asked God to show the people who the true Lord was. And what happened next was extraordinary. Fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water around the altar. This wasn't just a miracle. It was a public declaration of God's sovereignty. It's like God was saying, I am the one true God. It challenges us to reflect. In what areas of our lives do we need to invite God to act with his purifying fire? The impact of this miracle was immediate. The people who had been divided fell on their faces and declared, The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Elijah shows us that when we allow God to work visibly in our lives, it not only strengthens our own faith but also impacts those around us. Imagine what could happen if we lived so fully surrendered to God that others could see his hand in everything we do. That's the kind of faith that changes lives. But the confrontation didn't end there. Elijah commanded that the prophets of Baal be eliminated, a drastic but necessary step to purify Israel from idolatry. It might seem harsh, but it teaches us something important. We need to cut out anything in our lives that pulls us away from God. Whether it's a habit, a relationship, or even a mindset, just like Elijah dealt with the prophets of Baal, We're called to remove anything that compromises our faithfulness to the Lord. Mount Carmel wasn't just a place of miracles. It was a place of decision. Elijah forced the people to choose between God and Baal, between truth and lies. And that's a choice we have to make every day. There's no middle ground when it comes to being faithful to God. Elijah challenges us to ask ourselves, are we really living as though God is sovereign over every area of our lives? This showdown also highlights the importance of courage. Elijah was surrounded by opposition, but he didn't back down. He knew he was there as God's representative. Often in life, we face situations where we feel outnumbered or underestimated. Elijah reminds us that when we're with God, we're never truly alone. His presence gives us the strength to face any challenge. And so, Mount Carmel becomes a symbol not just of God's victory, but of the possibility of a fresh start for those who choose to return to Him. But what happens next? Well, Elijah's story doesn't end here. After the fire comes the rain, a powerful demonstration of God's mercy and might. After the jaw-dropping showdown on Mount Carmel, Elijah's story shifts to a moment of transition and hope. The end of a 3.5-year drought that had devastated Israel. Imagine the desperation of an entire nation, crops withering, livestock dying, families suffering without water. But even in the middle of this crisis, Elijah knew the drought wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a reflection of Israel's spiritual disconnection from God. When the people acknowledged God's sovereignty on Mount Carmel, Elijah understood it was time to seek God's mercy and pray for the rain to return. Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, not to rest after his victory, but to pray fervently. He knelt down, putting his face between his knees, a posture of complete humility before God. This moment teaches us something profound. Before we can experience God's blessings, we need to humble ourselves fully before Him. How often do we want answers from God but aren't willing to humble ourselves and seek Him sincerely? Elijah shows us that prayer isn't just a religious act, it's a direct connection to God's heart. Elijah's prayer was persistent. He asked his servant to look toward the horizon for any sign of rain, but 6 times the servant returned with the same answer. There's nothing. Imagine the weight of that moment. It would have been so easy to give up, to think maybe God wasn't going to respond. But Elijah didn't lose heart. He kept praying, fully convinced that God would fulfill His promise. This teaches us the importance of persevering in prayer, even when circumstances seem discouraging. How many times do we give up just before we're about to see God move, simply because His timing doesn't match ours? On the 7th time, the servant came back with a different report. I see a small cloud, about the size of a man's hand, rising from the sea. For Elijah, that was all he needed. He knew that tiny cloud was the beginning of a great downpour. This moment is such a powerful lesson about how God works. So often, He gives us small signs, little glimpses of His hand at work, and it's up to us to recognize them and have faith. Have you ever thought that maybe God's already starting to answer your prayers, but you haven't noticed because you're waiting for something bigger or more obvious? Elijah then sent a message to King Ahab, telling him to get ready because the rain was on its way. Shortly after, the clear sky darkened with thick clouds, and the rain came pouring down in abundance. What a breathtaking scene. It's the kind of moment that reminds us of God's power and faithfulness. He didn't just answer Elijah's prayer. He did it in a way that made it clear the drought was over for good. The sound of rain after so much dryness must have been music to the people's ears. But here's a fascinating detail. Elijah didn't just pray and wait. He acted. When he saw the sign of the cloud, he got ready, trusting that God would handle the rest. This teaches us that faith isn't just believing. It's taking action based on that belief. If we're praying for something, we should position ourselves as if we're already about to receive it. Elijah didn't sit around waiting for the rain. He moved toward the promise. The end of the drought also reminds us that God is a God of restoration. He didn't just send rain, He restored the land, the people's sustenance, and their hope. We all face dry seasons. emotionally, spiritually, even financially. But God can turn those situations around. He's the same God who sent the rain in Elijah's time, and He's more than capable of bringing restoration to any area of our lives today. This story also shows us that God works in His timing. The drought lasted for years, but it was only at the right moment, when the people acknowledged God's sovereignty, that the rain came. This teaches us the importance of trusting God's perfect timing. We often want immediate answers, but God knows exactly when to act, and His timing is always the best. Finally, the story of the drought's end points us to something even greater: God's mercy. Even after years of disobedience and idolatry, God didn't abandon His people. When they turned back to Him, He responded with grace and provision. It's a beautiful reminder that no matter how far we may have drifted, God is always ready to welcome us back and bless us. And so, the rain that fell that day wasn't just water. It was a symbol of God's love and care. But Elijah's journey wasn't over yet. After the rain, something extraordinary and unexpected happens. Elijah's strength is tested in a way few could imagine. Elijah's story gives us an extraordinary glimpse into how God takes care of His children, even in the toughest circumstances. After declaring the drought that would devastate Israel, God guided Elijah to the Chariot brook, a remote place where he could find refuge. There, God promised He'd be fed by ravens, bringing him bread and meat twice a day. Sounds almost surreal, right? Ravens, creatures known for being selfish, becoming instruments of divine provision. This part of the story is a powerful reminder that God can use anything or anyone to care for us, even the most unlikely or illogical sources. But God's provision for Elijah wasn't just about food and water. It was a season of learning, a time to trust fully in God while the world around him faced scarcity. Imagine the challenge of relying solely on something as unusual and uncertain as ravens delivering food. Elijah had to believe that God would stay true to His word every single day. This lesson is so practical for us today. In times of struggle, we're often called to trust God in ways that defy our understanding. As life often goes, though, circumstances changed. The Chariot brook, which had sustained Elijah, eventually dried up because of the drought. This didn't mean God had abandoned Elijah. It meant it was time for the next step. God instructed him to go to Zarephath, a city outside of Israel, where a widow would provide for him. Now think about this. A widow during a drought doesn't exactly scream abundance, does it? Once again, God teaches us that His provision doesn't depend on human conditions. He chooses the most unlikely situations to show His power. When Elijah arrived in Zarephath, he found the widow gathering sticks to prepare her last meal. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil left, and in her mind, this was it, a final meal before she and her son starved. Elijah asked her to trust God and make him a loaf of bread first. This was a test of faith for both the widow and Elijah. The widow obeyed, and the result was a continuous miracle. The flour and oil never ran out for the rest of the drought. This story teaches us that when we put God first, He takes care of our needs in supernatural ways. But God's provision isn't just about physical needs. The widow of Zarephath experienced another miracle through Elijah. Her son fell gravely ill and died. But after Elijah's fervent prayers, God brought the boy back to life. This event not only reaffirmed the widow's faith, but also showed how deeply God cares for every detail of our lives. He doesn't just take care of our physical survival. He meets our emotional and spiritual needs too. This story makes us think about how God works in our daily lives. Sometimes we're so focused on what we lack that we fail to notice the ravens He's sending to provide for us. Maybe God's provision is in a friend offering support during tough times, an unexpected opportunity, or even a moment of peace in the chaos. The key is to recognize and be grateful for these small things, because they're signs of His presence. Another fascinating aspect of God's provision in Elijah's life is how it came with clear instructions. God didn't just tell Elijah He'd take care of him. He gave him specific steps to follow. This teaches us that trusting God involves action on our part. It's not just sitting back and waiting for something to happen. It's staying alert to the directions He gives. It's like a divine partnership. God provides the resources, and we follow the plan. This narrative also challenges how we view generosity. The widow of Zarephath shows us that even in times of scarcity, we're called to share. She could have said no to Elijah, but instead, she chose to trust God and give what little she had. Because of her willingness, she experienced abundance. It makes you wonder, how can we be more generous, even when we feel like we don't have much? Maybe our generosity is the key to unlocking miracles in our lives and in the lives of others. Ultimately, Elijah's story of divine provision reminds us that God never abandons us. Even when the brook dries up or resources seem scarce, He already has a plan in motion. Our job is to trust, obey, and move forward. And as we walk this journey of faith, God reveals Himself in ways that strengthen our confidence in Him. Elijah shows us that even in tough times, there's always a God who provides, sometimes through ravens, other times through a widow, but always faithfully. But Elijah's journey doesn't end in Zarephath. After witnessing so many miracles and experiencing God's provision, Elijah would soon face one of the most extraordinary moments of his life, an event that would secure his place in history like no other. Elijah wasn't just a remarkable prophet because of his unshakable faith and boldness in confronting kings and false prophets. He was also at the center of one of the Bible's most extraordinary and mysterious moments, his ascension to heaven in a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot of fire. Think about the magnitude of that event. Elijah didn't experience death like everyone else. He was taken directly by God, a testament to the deep relationship between the prophet and his Creator. This moment is so unique that it echoes through history as a symbol of divine reward and spiritual transition. Before his departure, Elijah was instructed by God to visit several cities: Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, and finally the Jordan. These stops weren't just geographic destinations. Each carried deep spiritual significance, marking milestones in his journey and connection with God. Elijah knew his time was coming to an end, but he remained steadfast in his mission, paving the way for the future. What a powerful lesson. Even when we sense a season in our life is closing, we're called to fulfill our responsibilities with excellence because our obedience impacts the generations to come. Elisha, Elijah's devoted apprentice, accompanied him at every step of this final journey. He knew Elijah was about to be taken and had one burning desire: to receive a double portion of the Spirit that rested on his mentor. Here, we see the importance of spiritual mentorship and preparing for the future. With wisdom, Elijah challenged Elisha to stay vigilant, telling him that if he was present when Elijah ascended, he would receive his request. This teaches us that inheriting God's blessings requires us to stay alert, prepared, and ready to act at the right moment. When they arrived at the Jordan, Elijah performed yet another miracle that affirmed God's power in his life. He struck the water with his cloak, and it parted, allowing both of them to cross on dry ground. This wasn't just an impressive display. It symbolized the authority God had given Elijah and how that authority would continue through Elisha. It's as if God was declaring, "My power doesn't end with one person. It carries on through those who follow me faithfully." This scene challenges us to reflect on how we're impacting those who will come after us. Finally, the long-anticipated moment arrived. As Elijah and Elisha walked and talked, a chariot of fire with flaming horses appeared, separating the two of them. In a whirlwind, Elijah was taken up to heaven, leaving Elisha as the eyewitness to this glorious event. Imagine the scene: the sky opening, the roar of the wind, and the dazzling vision of the chariot of fire, a clear manifestation of God's glory. Elijah didn't just end his journey. He entered eternity in a way no other prophet ever had. It's impossible not to wonder, what kind of life must we live to leave behind such a profound legacy? Elisha's reaction was just as remarkable. He tore his clothes in mourning, but quickly picked up Elijah's cloak, a symbol that the mission was now his. This moment marked the prophetic transition and teaches us something crucial. God's purpose isn't halted by the absence of an individual. He always raises successors to carry on his work. And with the same spirit that rested on Elijah, Elisha began his journey, performing miracles that demonstrated God's power in his own life. Elijah's ascension points to God's faithfulness in honoring those who serve him with dedication. While not all of us are called to such a spectacular destiny, we can be certain that God sees our struggles, our work, and our faithfulness. In his perfect timing, he rewards us, whether in this life or in eternity. This promise is a powerful reminder that our labor for the Lord is never in vain. Moreover, Elijah's departure invites us to reflect on our own lives. Are we living in a way that leaves a lasting impact? Are we preparing others to continue the work we've started? Elijah's life teaches us that a life dedicated to God doesn't end with us. It continues through the people we influence, the key teachings we share, and the legacy we leave behind. The chariot of fire wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of God's glory and Elijah's passage into a new dimension of existence. This scene also points to something greater, the hope of resurrection and eternity with God. Elijah serves as a living reminder that our connection with God transcends this life. And as he disappeared into the heavens, the earthly world prepared for the next chapter of its spiritual story, now under Elisha's leadership. Though Elijah ascended, his story continues to resonate today, challenging us to live with faith, boldness, and purpose. His journey doesn't end with the chariot of fire. It lives on through the impact he made and the inspiration he offers. The question now is, how can we apply these lessons to our own walk of faith? Now that you've walked through Elijah's incredible journey, it's impossible not to ask yourself, what are we doing with our own lives? Elijah showed us that it's possible to live with purpose, courage, and a faith so intense it leaves a legacy that lasts beyond our time. Are we taking the opportunities to be a light in the darkness, or are we letting the distractions of the world drown out our calling? Think about it. You don't have to be a prophet to live an extraordinary life. God is ready to move in your life just like he did with Elijah. He can provide for you in hard times, perform miracles beyond your understanding, and even use you to impact others. But the real question is, are you willing to take the first step? To trust even when everything feels uncertain? To keep going even when the circumstances are telling you to give up? So here's my challenge for you. What can you change starting today? What areas of your life need a divine touch? Maybe it's time to rethink your priorities, to seek God more deeply, or even to reconnect with the purpose you know he's placed in your heart. Don't put it off until tomorrow. Every decision you make today has the power to shape your future and impact those around you. If this content touched your heart and inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more transformative stories and lessons like this one. And hey, what did you think? Drop a comment below and share how Elijah's story impacted you. I'd really love to hear about it. And remember, there are other amazing videos popping up on the screen right now. Click on them and keep diving into content that will transform the way you see life. I'll see you in the next video, and may God bless you always.